Hey guys. So today you and I are going to talk about design. So let's get into it. So the question in question was, hi Frederick. The statement goes, the goal of design is not to achieve a perfect product, but to identify and eliminate bad designs, quote unquote, that are likely to result in high risk failures. Do you agree with this statement? Why and or why not? Well, for me, it's sort of weird that okay, does this like okay, so the goal is not to achieve a perfect product, but to eliminate bad with design is not a main aim to create a perfect product. It's about removing bad design. And there's another saying that perfection is when there is nothing more that can be taken away. So to me, like this is basically a like you're basically saying the same thing. So you're not supposed to make a perfect product. You're just supposed to take away everything that is bad about it, which, as I said, it amounts to the same thing, in my opinion. So what I would say is that if we go and get a little bit more concrete and less philosophical about this, I think that when it comes to at least system design, the goal is to put the code or the system in a state where it is doing all the things that it needs to be doing, accounting for all reasonable, like, and this is the key term, reasonable scenarios in which it will be used. Like you have to sort of look at what's the range of use cases you have right now and put it into that state so it meets those requirements, and simultaneously put it in a state where long-term maintenance, continued development, and scope changes are easy to facilitate and execute on. That is what I argue good design. I go as far as to say that at least for me, the biggest tell as to whether or not you have a good architecture or system design or something like that comes from this one key observation, and that is if you measure the cost of changing something, that is the best receipt you can have, in my opinion, on the quality of the work that you have in your hands. Like what's the quality of the system and the developers and things like that. So what I usually look for, if we take, I can give you a short little story of mine from a place of work I had very recently. So I was tasked with doing a technical evaluation of a few teams, and so this is basically like a few stakeholders within the company. They're asking for my technical, like my expert opinion about what's the state of this code and so forth and so forth. And as you can imagine, like for me, that basically comes back to the same thing we do when we start a new project. You go through the code, you sort of look at things, you look at the documentation if there is any, and you talk to a few people, and then you learn a little bit about the infrastructure, where is the source, the repo, what CI pipelines do they have, what practices do they have within the team? Is it Scrum? Is it Lean, Kanban? Like what are they doing? Are they doing code reviews or like these sorts of rituals that every team has to one degree or another? And based on your own experience, or in this case my experience, you make a basic assessment of what you would expect, or based on your knowledge, of course, from like what's it's sort of like taking the pulse on the thing, right? And so one of the key observations that I did when I did this for one of the teams was that I asked them, okay, so how do you do testing? This is one of my favorite questions to ask because you will tell me immediately more than anything else. And basically what they told me was that, yeah, we do like unit testing, and then we do some like peer testing and stuff like that, and then we have a QA team, and then they do testing and things like that. And then I immediately latch on to that. Okay, so you have a QA team, great. What does their process look like? Like usually how, like when they do, I'm assuming they are doing regression testing. Yeah, they do regression testing. Okay, so roughly how long do they usually spend on, like before every release? Like how much time do they have with their testing? And he says they have about 2 weeks of regression testing. Now that is an interesting number to me, because if you have 2 weeks of regression testing, odds are that that is all manual work, because no automation, like an automated process, would take that long. And odds are also extremely high that, which my suspicion is now, and then my follow-up question becomes, how many times do you release? Roughly, what is your release cycle? Oh, about four times a year, or just a few times a year. That's all I need to know about your system, to know that you have a extremely error-prone system, where the only reason why you release usually, I'm not saying that this is definitive, but these are my suspicions, and I can confirm them later, of course, by talking to the stakeholders and so forth. But odds are that there's a lot of release fear here. Odds are that the system is so error prone that your entire process is basically tailored to maximizing people's confidence in that when you actually do make a release, everything is working. And the way you do that is by manually testing everything, because your entire process is basically a manual regression test. That when it comes to releasing, that tells me that the code is probably in a really bad state. The software developers probably are not doing their part, because the teams that usually do have very effective handles on their architecture and their testing and things like that, these are all things, these things are combined. I usually say that the worse your code, well, that's not just my saying, a lot of the people who advocate for test-driven development, or not necessarily just test-driven development, but any type of automated testing, will tell you that if your code sucks, your tests are going to suffer for it. It's going to be very difficult to test that code. So if you write better software, your tests will be easier to write. And I can only sort of echo that statement, especially in front end. Holy shit, I have to this day never seen a React developer, if we talk about React specifically, who could write efficient unit tests. And it comes back to the fact that they don't actually know how to write a good component in a way that makes it testable. It's easy for the backend developers, yes, usually a little bit, but that's my experience at the very least. And so these are the sorts of things that I look for when I look to evaluate just how well is your system working. Because if the stakeholders are unhappy, the cost of, as I said here, as you hopefully derived from my little story here, the cost of change here is massive. If you just think about the amount of testing that has to happen with the developers, and then full-time employees for 2 weeks sitting there and just testing everything and make sure that everything is okay and so forth, and they can only ship every so often, that it's not like a continuous flow of value, that's a lot of cost for this system. And so odds are that this system is not really well made. It is probably in a state which is pretty poorly designed, and I can only say that this is at least how I usually determine whether or not you actually have a good architecture or not. It's the same thing I've said in other videos, where if I ask you how long will it take you to implement a feature, and then you just listen to the answer. If things take a long time, especially if some things are of course going to take a lot of time because they're very complicated requests, but some things are, I've been in companies where, I think I've said this before, we asked for a filtering function on a list API that just lists a bunch of data, and they told us we can't do that. We can't filter your data for you. And so I said, so your entire API system is built in such a way that the only way to get the data I want from you is by getting the whole database and then doing the filtering client side. Yes. Okay. How long would it take you to fix that problem? We would have to put it on the backlog, and it would take around 9 months. 9 months to get a query parameter that allows you to filter on something as complicated as the date. Can I get all the records from before this, or between these two dates, for example? A pretty, I would say, standard request, all things considered. There are absolutely situations where that might not be so standard, but in this case you just have to take my word for it. It was a pretty standard thing that we were doing within the company. So what I want you to take away from this is that I don't really understand these sorts of, to me this statement is it's basically just saying that design is meant to create perfect systems, because if you remove all the bad things, what would be remaining? That's a question of definition. But if you want my more blue collar or worker class answer, sort of just rednecking it a little bit, and then I would say, hey, good systems work, and they are easy to scale. They fulfill the requirements at like whatever you have right now, because there's no such thing as creating a system that will just be evergreen forever, usually, unless you're I can't even think of something that I can think of concepts that are evergreen, but not like actual practical solutions that will just forever be the best. But with that said, as I said, some things are very complicated. Though I hope that by the time you get to be as old and gray as me, you will start to see a pattern where usually when you see that regression testing takes a really, really long time, releases are not all that frequent, people are usually have a lot of fear and anxiety and low trust in the system, and these other factors I was talking about, like it's hard to like add new functionality or things like that, that's usually an indicator that the entire system has been poorly designed. Because at least from my experience, when people really know their shit and they have a well-structured code base, well-designed system, and so forth and so forth, most things are pretty straightforward. It's usually not that complicated. It's just, to me, hilarious that there are so many shitty solutions out in the ecosystem that for quite a lot of people, IT is like a byword for a lot of problems and headaches with shitty systems. And it's just sad that it is so common that's people that most, and some people think that that is how it is, like it always. And I go, no, it's not always that way. It's just that it's that difficult to find people, and like you put, everything has to align perfectly for you to not have that situation. Have a great day.